Chapter 1. The Fundamental Issues. Slavery. Slavery is an essential part of any examination of antebellum America or any attempt to analyze the causes of the Civil War. But the problems inherent in studying an institution so vast and complex are formidable. By 1860, there were 3,950,000 slaves in the country, spread through 15 states from Delaware to Texas, from Florida to Missouri. There were 384,000 slave owners in a southern white population of 7 million, holding from 1 to, in a single instance, 1,000 bondsmen. The majority owned from 1 to 6. About 3% owned more than 100. Slaves might work under close supervision in broad cotton fields as part of a highly disciplined gang, or in factories alongside whites. They might live in towns, hire themselves out for set fees, part of which they could keep, and enjoy a considerable degree of personal freedom. Slaves might be house servants, daily in close contact with whites, or drivers, occupying positions of responsibility and exercising authority over other slaves. Slaves might be almost exclusively field laborers, as great numbers were, but they could also be wheelwrights, blacksmiths, painters, carpenters, coopers, cooks, seamstresses, or nurses, to either blacks or whites. Slaves might be kindly treated, have garden plots of their own, or even their own businesses. In rare cases, they might be able to buy their freedom. Slaves were sometimes loved and cherished by their masters as if they were members of the family. Hannah, a slave, continued sensible to the very last and could speak until within 5 minutes. The last thing she said, "All the time you are all doing something for me and giving me something good." In a few minutes after, she died, surrounded by a weeping group, white and black, as we all knelt in prayer at her bedside. When we lose our servants, the loss of their services is the last thing we think of. It is the shadow on our household when an attached faithful one is removed. From Robert M. Myers, Children of Pride. On the other hand, slaves might be miserably fed, housed, and clothed, brutally mistreated and worked to the limit of endurance, as the following newspaper advertisements show. Stop the runaway. $50 reward. Eloped from the subscriber living near Nashville on the 25th of June last. A mulatto man-slave. The above reward will be given any person that will take him and deliver him to me, or secure him in jail so I can get him. If taken out of the state, the above reward, and all reasonable expenses paid, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him to the amount of 300. Signed, Andrew Jackson, near Nashville, State of Tennessee runaway slave. Is detained in the public prison. A Negro about 20 years of age, calls himself William, he is black and has a down look. When committed, had around his neck an iron collar with 3 prongs extending upwards, has many scars on his back and shoulders from the whip. Owners are requested to prove property and take him away. From U.B. Phillips, Plantation and Frontier. How well can one generalize about an institution that involved millions of people and existed under such a variety of conditions? The perplexities of that question, when added to the ideological and political conflict over slavery, have produced a debate that is still going on, and that has made the history of slavery preeminently a problem in historiography. Southern planters defended the institution as a humane and necessary means of controlling, civilizing, and Christianizing a semi-barbarous people. Abolitionists charged that slavery itself was a relic of barbarism, sinful, cruel, and degrading. About the only thing concerning blacks that the vast majority of antebellum Americans agreed on was that they were innately inferior to whites. After the war, most Southerners were willing to concede that slavery had been wrong, or at least that it had been a burden to the whites, although they continued to deny that it had been cruel. And the North, by its actions, eventually agreed that congressional Reconstruction had been a mistake, and that the South was right in segregating and disfranchising the Negro. Thus, prevailing racial attitudes paved the way for a more favorable historical view of slavery in the early 20th century, when it came to be seen as a mild, paternalistic social system generally acquiesced in by the slaves. In the 1920s, however, there occurred a re-examination and subsequent repudiation of the concept of innate racial differences. The new attitude toward race, strengthened by reaction to the horrors of Nazi racism and the growing political influence of black voters, cleared the way for the civil rights movement of the 1950s. The sympathetic view of slavery that had been accepted by scholars for a generation was supplanted by what has been called the Northern Liberal, or sometimes neo-abolitionist interpretation. It emphasized the profit motive, the harshness of slavery, the rebelliousness of the slaves, and denied the existence of inherent racial differences. This approach to slavery soon came under attack from several directions. Some historians complained that the Northern Liberal School was merely prolonging the North-South debate of the 1850s and urged that a comparative study of various slave societies be substituted for this parochial viewpoint. More striking was the rehabilitation, minus assumptions of racial inferiority, of an amplified and refined concept of slavery as a paternalistic system that was defended by Southerners for reasons other than monetary profit. Complementing this interpretation to some degree was the work of certain econometricians, that is, practitioners of a new economic history, who reached their conclusions by using computer technology to gather and process their data, which they then elucidated by using sophisticated mathematical techniques. These econometricians concluded, among other things, that plantation slavery was efficient and profitable, that the material circumstances of the slaves compared favorably with those of free white workers in the North, that slaves were well-fed, well-housed, well-paid, and rarely whipped, that slave families were seldom disrupted, and so forth. The validity of these conclusions was immediately and vehemently challenged by other econometricians as well as by more traditional historians. This confusion of the scholarly community as to the nature of slavery, especially as to its cruelty or benevolence, coincided with increasing racial turmoil and resistance to integration in various northern cities during the 1960s and 1970s. Fortunately, as the history of slavery swings back and forth between extremes of ideology and bias, it brings to light much additional information that will help to narrow the area of disagreement. In time, perhaps the pendulum will come to rest, and a picture of slavery will emerge that can be generally accepted as accurate and comprehensive. Abolition. Antebellum Americans, unlike modern historians, had few doubts as to what slavery was like or what it meant. This was especially true of its most militant opponents, the abolitionists, and its most determined defenders, Southern slave owners. How could Americans who shared a common cultural, religious, and political tradition have come to differ so radically on such a fundamental question as the ownership of one person by another? The answer may lie in the fact that both slavery and abolition were rooted in the same great developments that gave rise to the modern world. Slavery was a child of the commercial revolution, which began in the 14th century and extended into the 18th century. That revolution consisted of the emergence of a capitalist economy and long-range trade, and resulted in a demand for colonies to produce the commodities that fed this extensive commerce. Because the native population was sparse in most parts of the New World, large numbers of African slaves were imported to cultivate sugar, rice, tobacco, and other valuable crops. The commercial revolution was also the basis for intellectual and cultural changes that led ultimately to the 18th century Enlightenment. The political philosophy of that period revolved around the idea of natural law and the natural rights of man, defined by John Locke as life, liberty, and property. Inevitably, many came to believe that there was an inherent conflict between slavery and natural rights, that the right to own property did not extend to property in human beings. Religion also became a major source of anti-slavery sentiment, largely because it had to adjust to the new order of things. This was especially true of Calvinism, which, in reacting against the corruption and lack of spirituality in the Catholic Church, had adopted an otherworldly theology that emphasized predestination, the inability of the sinner to win salvation by good works, and dourly expected the great majority of mankind to suffer everlasting torment in the hereafter. This depressing outlook could not indefinitely withstand the growing optimism that swept the Western world in the 17th and 18th centuries. When the wealth of America and the Orient began to invigorate Europe, the idea of progress was born. Heaven no longer held the only hope for a better life. Now the world seemed filled with promise, and not only for the privileged few, as had been the case in the static and stratified society of the Middle Ages. Western man began to concentrate on the now instead of the hereafter. It was therefore particularly necessary for Calvinism, which was strong in England and in the northern colonies, to change if it was to compete with the newfound charms of this life. It had to become more worldly, to devote itself to benevolent undertakings here below. It came under growing pressure to open heaven's door to all men and women. Salvation would no longer be confined to a predestined minority, but would depend more and more on the individual's volition and deeds. This can be seen as a democratization of religion. Just as America promised the average man access to economic and political opportunities, so it would offer an equal chance for salvation. The promise of life in America, this other Eden, seemed so bright that many believed the second coming of Christ must be near, and they decided to improve society in order to prepare for the kingdom of God on earth. For such people, reform became a wide road to salvation. It was the responsibility of the whole community, the whole country, for God held society accountable for the sins of every member. It was especially the responsibility of religious leaders who were the moral stewards of society. So, by the 19th century, as religion was secularized, many reform movements were filled with religious zeal. They became battles between good and evil, sin and salvation. They became crusades, such as the crusade against slavery. Beginning in the 18th century, conversion and overwhelming conviction of salvation was more and more a phenomenon of religious revivals. Revivals were in turn the main feature of a religious awakening. There were two great awakenings before the Civil War. The first, lasting approximately from 1725 to 1750, centered in New England. The second, 1795 to 1835, centered in the part of New York that was heavily colonized from New England. Both spread far beyond their original boundaries. The most striking figure of the Second Awakening was Charles Grandison Finney, perhaps the greatest evangelist in American history. During the 1820s, anxious sinners flocked to Finney's revivals by the tens of thousands. His doctrine was a far cry from the pure Calvinism of earlier days. All people, he said, have heaven within their reach. Sin was merely selfishness. Holiness consisted of disinterested benevolence. Conversion, salvation, meant repenting of the sin of selfishness and then setting out with a determination to aim at being useful in the highest degree possible. The tidal wave of religious fervor whipped up by the Great Revival was channeled into reform, most especially into the abolition movement. The supremely eloquent Theodore Dwight Weld and other young ministerial students who, like Weld, had assisted Finney and had mastered his techniques, led an abolition revival that swept through many northern states. Just as Finney had called on the people to repent of the sin of selfishness, so his disciples called on them to renounce the sin of slavery. By the late 1830s, the American Anti-Slavery Society claimed over 1,300 local chapters and 250,000 members. William Lloyd Garrison, a pioneer abolitionist and founder of the famous Liberator, was for a time part of this movement. However, he drifted away from the mainstream of the anti-slavery impulse, and although recently some scholars have reaffirmed his importance, his notoriety was greater than his influence. The dramatic increase in popular support for abolition guaranteed that slavery would quickly become a political issue, which it did just as the revivals reached their peak. The elimination of slavery in the District of Columbia had for years been a primary target of abolitionists, and petitions on that and other aspects of slavery were regularly presented to Congress. As the number increased, the House of Representatives adopted a rule in 1836 to prevent consideration of the petitions. This so-called gag rule was resented by some Northern members, led by ex-President John Quincy Adams, as an attack by a cabal of slave owners on the constitutional liberties of all Americans. Recognizing the value of the controversy as a propaganda vehicle, abolitionists organized a gigantic campaign and sent anti-slavery petitions to Washington by the ton. The gag rule fight continued through one Congress after another. Not until 1844 did the House repeal the rule. Meanwhile, slavery had become a political issue in other ways. The same year that the gag rule was passed, Texas won its independence from Mexico. Many anti-slavery people concluded that this was part of a dark plot by the slaveocracy to acquire more land for the sinful institution. Belief in sinister conspiracies has always been a feature of American political psychology, and before many years had passed, increasing numbers of Northerners were convinced that the slaveocrats designed to extend slavery not only into the Southwest, but into the free states as well. Having in this way become politically invincible, they would proceed to subvert the Constitution and set themselves up as a ruling oligarchy. The events of the 1840s and 1850s would render this idea plausible to still more Northerners, swelling the ranks of the anti-slavery forces. Economics. The conflict over slavery was compounded by deep-seated differences on economic and constitutional theory going back to the 18th century. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government could not levy taxes or regulate commerce. When the framers of the Constitution granted those powers to Congress, they made a fundamental change in the nature of the government, for men of that day understood clearly that political power followed the taxing power. Thus, the Constitution allowed a transfer of power from the states to the federal government, proportional to the latter's exercise of its new authority. This disturbed the many Southerners who had an abiding distrust of any government outside of or superior to the states. In particular, they were reluctant to surrender control over their commerce to a potentially hostile majority, since the South lived by exporting its agricultural commodities. Finally, they knew that slavery was rapidly dying out in the North, where its unpopularity increased as the number of slaves dwindled. Therefore, Southern delegates at the Philadelphia Convention accepted the Constitution only after insisting on several concessions, such as outlawing an export tariff and bolstering the South's political strength by counting 3 of every 5 slaves when apportioning seats in the House of Representatives. Hamilton's economic program and the Federalists' political behavior in the 1790s confirmed Southern misgivings about the new system. Even James Madison, sometimes called the father of the Constitution, must have felt rather like Baron Frankenstein the morning after. In reaction to the Federalists' centralizing policies, he and Jefferson founded the states' rights school of politics, whose main object was to restore the influence of the states by keeping the federal government weak. This was to be done by allowing the latter to use only those powers expressly delegated to it by the Constitution, and by preventing it from levying more taxes than were absolutely necessary. Thus, the flow of political power toward the center would be reversed. The common theme running through all the varieties of the states' rights philosophy was that of a small, frugal, passive central government, whose main function was to represent the states in their dealings with foreign nations. This philosophy reflected the South's economic needs as well as its political beliefs. By the 1830s, several issues had come to dominate American economic thought. Tariff policy, federal funding of roads, canals, and river and harbor projects, all known as internal improvements. Federal subsidies to private business, public land policy, and financial policy, that is, whether or not the federal government should charter a central bank. For present purposes, the bank may be ignored because it was more a party than a sectional question. During most of the antebellum period, the main bone of contention was the tariff, the chief source of federal revenue. The growth of northern manufacturing during and after the War of 1812 created a demand for protection against competition from cheap foreign goods. The South, on the other hand, opposed a high tariff because it increased the planter's cost of living and cost of production, restricted foreign markets for Southern commodities, and, through high profits and inequitable federal expenditures, transferred wealth from South to North. The South also opposed federal subsidies for internal improvements and private business. Most of these funds would be spent in the North, and the additional demands on the Treasury would necessitate raising the tariff. That was also a reason for resisting legislation that would give away the vast public lands. A reduction in land revenues would tend to drive up the tariff. Moreover, given the facts of geography and the North's large and relatively mobile population, free land would mean new states settled by Northerners and would create more political problems for the South. There were, of course, Southerners who dissented from prevailing attitudes, but they were always a decided minority. Northern support for these policies was not as solid as Southern opposition. Otherwise, the South could not afford even a delaying action. But Northerners agreed more than they differed, and as the effects of the revolution in transportation and industry were felt, disagreement diminished while impatience with the South intensified. That section came to be seen as the chief obstacle in the way of Northern progress and prosperity. Eventually, this resentment could combine with the anti-slavery impulse to produce a new political movement aimed at expelling Southern influence from the government. Territorial slavery, symbol and substance. The existence of intersectional political parties greatly enhanced the likelihood of compromising sectional differences. In ordinary times, party unity was essential to winning elections. Therefore, during the 1830s and early 1840s, the Whigs and Democrats, who counted on support in both North and South, strove to keep intra-party hostilities to a minimum. But as abolition attracted new recruits, it became more difficult to keep the most explosive issue of all out of the political arena. Abolitionists came to hold the balance of power in certain key states such as New York and Ohio, and to exert influence all out of proportion to their numbers by forcing both parties to bid for their support. Northern politicians encountered growing difficulty in justifying their alliance with Southerners when the latter clamored for the gag rule or Texas annexation. The depression that followed the Panic of 1837 undermined support for President Martin Van Buren, leader of the Northeastern Democrats, and helped to prevent his re-election in 1840. His defeat caused the party's center of balance to move in a southerly direction. The party rejected Van Buren in 1844 and nominated a Southerner, James K. Polk of Tennessee. The Van Buren faction, angered and humiliated by their leader's repudiation, feared that they had lost their easy access to offices and governmental patronage. The continued demands of some Southern Democrats for the immediate annexation of Texas aggravated their already serious problems with an increasingly anti-slavery constituency. Here, then, was one crack in the foundation of the party, the disaffection of the Northeastern Democrats, that would contribute powerfully to the party's final division along sectional lines. Events following the election of 1844 placed additional strains on party loyalty. Polk's defeat of Henry Clay weakened the Whigs and led to the abandonment of their remaining political principles. On the Democratic side, the Polk administration soon delivered a series of hammer blows to party unity. Although he ran on a platform proclaiming the reoccupation of Oregon, Polk surrendered claims to almost half of that territory. Democrats in the Old Northwest felt betrayed. Almost simultaneously, Polk's provocative policy on the Texas frontier ignited a war with Mexico that many Northerners saw as part of the slaveocracy's plot to augment Southern power. The worst was yet to come. A major objective of Polk's administration was a reduced tariff, aimed at eventual free trade with England, a better market for cotton and other commodities, and lower costs for the planter and farmer. The tariff passed in the summer of 1846 attracted numerous Northwestern supporters who would later claim that they had thereby concluded a bargain with the South. Votes for a low tariff in exchange for generous appropriations for internal improvements and support for cheap or even free public lands. But after voting for the tariff, they saw Polk veto the Internal Improvements Bill and Southern congressmen defeat the Land Bill. At the same time, tariff reduction had alienated protectionists throughout the North. More and more Northerners drew what seemed to them an obvious conclusion. The repudiation of Van Buren, Texas annexation, Oregon's partition, the Mexican War, a low tariff, no internal improvements, no cheap land clearly. Southern policies meant the sacrifice of Northern political, territorial, and economic ambitions. Said the editor of a Chicago paper, "The North can and will no longer be hoodwinked. If no measures for protection and improvement of anything North or West are to be suffered by our Southern masters, if we are to be downtrodden, and all our cherished interests crushed by them, a signal revolution will inevitably ensue. The same spirit and energy that forced emancipation for the whole country from Great Britain will throw off the Southern yoke. The North and West will look to and take care of their own interests henceforth. They will see, that the power to oppress shall not again be entrusted to men who have shown themselves to be slaveholders, but not Americans. The fiat has gone forth. Southern rule is at an end. From A.O. Craven, Edmund Ruffin, Southerner. In this gloomy setting, the issue of territorial slavery took the center of the stage. The connection between extending slavery and Southern power seemed obvious. For example, the votes of recently admitted Texas provided the margin necessary to pass the tariff of 1846 in the Senate. Therefore, there should be no more slave territory, no more slave states. On August 8, 1846, Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania attached to an appropriations bill his famous amendment to exclude slavery from any soil acquired from Mexico. Party lines disappeared. Southerners of all political persuasions united to repel this attempt to reduce further their already declining strength. The attack on slavery as an institution unworthy of national protection frightened them. The Northern majority in the House passed Wilmot's proviso. The Senate, more conservative and still equally divided between the sections, did not. In this way, the intractable problem of territorial slavery was injected into national politics, never to be entirely removed, until it gave way to the even graver crisis of disunion. Its significance can be understood only in the context of the events just sketched, which had illuminated so vividly the sharp clash of interests between North and South. Each section feared subjugation by the other. The South saw itself as the weaker party, which it was. The North believed that the South, already wielding disproportionate influence, was determined to weight the balance of power in its favor. By the late 1840s, the idea of a slave power conspiracy had gained wider credence, and the conspiracy's primary objective appeared to be the extension of slavery. The South, on the other hand, regarded the right to take slaves into the territories as a test. The triumph of exclusion would mean that the North was no longer willing to concede to the South equality within the Union, which was an unwritten yet fundamental part of the original constitutional bargain of 1787. Now weaker in numbers, the South could rely only on strict interpretation of the Constitution to safeguard its interests. If slave owners were denied the right to take their property into the common territories, then obviously the Constitution was no longer to be relied on for protection. The day might not be far distant when the South would be ground down by superior power. Slavery, in short, was not only an issue in itself, it had also become the symbol of all differences between the sections. That is why it became such a powerful political force. Many Northerners saw it as a moral question, as right versus wrong. By their nature, moral questions are not subject to compromise. Therefore, it became ever more difficult for the political process to get past that issue and deal with the very important economic and political matters that were normally amenable to negotiation, and the settlement of which would have substantially reduced the importance of the slavery controversy. The essence of the Union from its foundation had been compromise. Without compromise, the Union was in danger. The Mexican War ended early in 1848. The cession of California and the Southwest to the United States, plus the impending presidential election, kept Wilmot's proviso very much alive. The Democratic platform took no position on territorial slavery, although its nominee, Lewis Cass of Michigan, endorsed popular sovereignty. This expedient would allow the settlers to decide local questions, including slavery, without interference from Congress, and for a few years this middle course was acceptable to many Democrats from both sections. The Whigs finessed the issue by ignoring it and nominating Zachary Taylor, a Louisiana planter and Jackson-type military hero. In the South, the Whigs stressed Taylor's Southern identity, and in the North they emphasized his alleged willingness, which Taylor neither affirmed nor denied, to accept the Wilmot Proviso. There was a party that faced the territorial question squarely, the New Free Soil Party, built around the embittered Van Buren faction of the New York Democracy and the Old Liberty Party. The Free Soilers met first at Utica and then at Buffalo, bracketing the district of the Finney revivals. They sang hymns and nominated Van Buren. Their platform called for resisting the aggressions of the slave power and excluding slavery from the territories. It also dealt with more mundane matters, free federal land, federal funding of internal improvements, and, by clear implication, a higher tariff. Hard-headed economic objectives were now coupled with the moral issue of slavery. Here began the forging of a wholly Northern party that would no longer seek to compromise sectional differences. The Free Soil ticket attracted about 10% of the popular vote in 1848. It almost certainly threw New York to Taylor, and with New York went the presidency. For the first time, a purely Northern, anti-Southern party had apparently tipped the scales in a presidential election. The Compromise of 1850. The election of 1848 was a clear warning that the two major parties probably could not survive a protracted conflict over slavery. Many believed that the Union could not survive the destruction of intersectional parties. Consequently, slavery had to be banished from national politics if the Union was to be saved. At least three matters required prompt attention: the territories, extradition of slaves who escaped to the North, and the status of slavery in the District of Columbia, which had been a prime concern of the Great Petition campaign of the 1830s. The territorial puzzle was a complex one. In 1787, the Confederation Congress had barred slavery from the Old Northwest, and in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Federal Congress had done the same for the Louisiana Purchase north of 36 degrees 30 minutes. Now the anti-slavery faction, including numerous Northern Democrats and Whigs as well as Free Soilers, wished to complete the process and ban slavery from the Mexican Cession. On the other hand, many moderates from both sections favored some form of popular sovereignty. A significant number of Southerners, led by Calhoun, maintained that Congress could not constitutionally outlaw slavery and, if necessary, was duty-bound to protect the property rights of slave owners in the territories. For the most part, this group was willing to compromise by extending the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific. Congress attempted to deal with the Mexican Cession while the presidential campaign was in progress. In July, the Senate voted to create territorial governments for California and New Mexico, which then embraced all of the Mexican Cession, denying them authority to establish or forbid slavery. Questions on that subject could be appealed to the Supreme Court. A territory of Oregon would likewise be created, excluding slavery indirectly by applying to Oregon the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance and by validating anti-slavery laws already passed by the Oregonians' extra-legal squatter government. The Senate plan was defeated in the House mainly by Northern votes, although the division was as much partisan as sectional, with Whigs in opposition. Oregon was finally organized without slavery, but California and New Mexico remained in limbo. Senator Stephen A. Douglas tried again after Congress reconvened in December. He proposed to admit the entire Mexican Cession as the state of California, reserving the right to create additional states from the eastern portion. In this way, the Illinois Democrat hoped to circumvent the difficult constitutional question. Later, he offered an alternative plan to admit California proper, saying nothing about New Mexico. Neither this nor any other project advanced during the 1848 to 1849 session commanded majority support. In the meantime, Calhoun and the Southern Democrats published an address detailing the aggressive behavior of the anti-slavery forces and warning their constituents that they must meet these attacks firmly. Southern Whigs refused to sign the address. They feared absorption into the opposition party, disliked antagonizing the incoming Whig president, who opposed Calhoun's views, and hoped that when sectional interests were at stake, Taylor would be loyal to his heritage. Many soon wished they had signed, because in his brief and non-committal inaugural address, Taylor said nothing about the territories. Instead, he secretly instructed military officers in New Mexico and California to assist the settlers in forming state governments, thus skipping the territorial stage. Californians had completed this work by the time Congress met in December 1849, and the New Mexicans followed suit a few months later. When Congress got wind of these activities, Taylor explained that his strategy would relieve Congress from the necessity of dealing with the territorial question. Furthermore, Texas and New Mexico were engaged in a potentially explosive boundary dispute. And if New Mexico were a state, the Supreme Court would have jurisdiction over the case. Taylor's program was intolerable to many Southerners, who believed it was indistinguishable from the Wilmot Proviso. California had already voted against slavery. If admitted immediately as a state, the sectional balance in the Senate would shift permanently in favor of the North. Calhoun's warning of a year ago now seemed distressingly believable. The possibility of secession could not longer be lightly dismissed. A convention of southern states, inspired by Calhoun and summoned by Mississippi, was scheduled to meet at Nashville in June. Events had begun to take on a momentum of their own that, if not somehow deflected, would lead inexorably to national disaster. At this grim juncture of affairs, Henry Clay, once more in the Senate, stepped forward to resume his accustomed role as peacemaker. His solution was all-inclusive, as he explained to the Senate early in February 1850. California would be admitted immediately as a free state. Its inhabitants had decided against slavery anyway, so the South would lose nothing. New Mexico and Deseret, Utah, comprising the rest of the Mexican cession, would be organized as territories without forbidding slavery. The North would be making no concession here because slavery was barred by the environment. The Texas-New Mexico boundary dispute would be equitably resolved by having Texas surrender its claims in exchange for federal assumption of the Texas Republic's debt. There would be a new effective fugitive slave law, since the extradition of runaways was a plain constitutional duty. The slave trade would be abolished in the District of Columbia, and no vital Southern interest would be injured thereby. Finally, Congress would renounce any intention to interfere with the interstate slave trade, which abolitionists had long wished to outlaw as one way of undermining slavery in the Upper South. This would be a concession to the South. A month later, the other Whig patriarch, Daniel Webster, endorsed Clay's plan in his famous 7th of March speech, showing that he could rise above principle in the interests of national harmony. The Massachusetts senator had long been a towering political landmark, and his speech naturally received wide attention. Even if Webster did not change any votes on the spot, his conciliatory attitude certainly allayed Southern fears to some degree and so advanced the cause of compromise. 3 days before Webster's address, a fatally ill Calhoun had offered his valedictory to the nation in a speech read by a colleague. Calhoun scornfully rejected Taylor's Trojan horse of California statehood and dismissed Clay's resolutions as mere symptomatic treatment. Nor did he believe in the efficacy of impassioned patriotic rhetoric. The cry of Union, Union, the glorious Union, can no more prevent disunion than the cry of health, health, glorious health, on the part of the physician, can save a patient lying dangerously ill. He addressed his analysis to the causes, not the symptoms of the disease. The equality of political power once enjoyed by the South had been overturned by discriminatory economic policies and by excluding the South from most of the public domain. Simultaneously, the growing Northern majority had begun to construe the Constitution so as to magnify federal power and belittle states' rights, the ultimate safeguard for the Southern minority. For years, the North had denounced the South, its institutions, morals, and way of life. Northern hostility appeared to intensify as Southern strength diminished. Little wonder, said Calhoun, that his section had begun to ask if it could remain much longer in the Union with safety and honor. If disunion was to be averted, the North must cease its attacks and agree to a constitutional amendment that enabled the South to protect itself from the Northern majority. The Great Triumvirate was followed by a prominent anti-slavery Whig from New York, William H. Seward. He was one of a new breed of politicians to whom compromise on the slavery question was contemptible, men who would in a few years construct a sectional anti-Southern party that would win the presidency in 1860. Seward denounced any compromise of the territorial question. Not only did the Constitution bar the extension of slavery, he said, but a law higher than the Constitution had already banned it from that vast area. Moreover, the abolition of slavery everywhere was both inevitable and imminent. Nor could the South escape its fate by seceding, because the perpetuity of the Union had been ordained by the laws of nature. Seward, in effect, told the South that his section, representing an aggressive industrial and commercial capitalism, was the wave of the future, and that the South's archaic society was doomed to early extinction. Seward was right, of course. And there is perhaps no more tragic event in all of American history than the failure of the South to accept the inevitability of adjusting to the main currents of the modern world. Had the South made those changes gradually and voluntarily, much that was valuable in the Southern tradition might have been saved. Instead, everything was swept away by the withering blast of war. However, before condemning antebellum Southerners as stupid or blindly stubborn, it may be well to point out that the situation of the United States in the late 20th century is not unlike that of the South in the 1850s. A minority defending a social and economic system that is supported by a dwindling portion of the human race. In Congress during the winter of 1849 to 1850, tempers were higher than ever before. The House, where a handful of free soilers held the balance of power between Democrats and Whigs, had taken 3 weeks and 62 ballots to choose a speaker. To say nothing of protracted contests over minor offices down to and including the doorkeeper. Extremist opinion challenged the soothing influences of Clay and Webster, and although Calhoun died at the end of March, his doctrinaire spirit still animated his disciples. With Seward at his elbow, Taylor stubbornly held to his original plan, while the impending convention at Nashville was a continual reminder that the South might well unite to oppose the president. The scattered population of New Mexico had drawn up a free state constitution and thus won Northern support in their boundary quarrel with Texas. Southerners, for the same reason, sided with Texas. An armed collision there involving volunteers from other states seemed a real possibility. In Congress, several of Clay's proposals were combined into one omnibus bill, thereby uniting the opposition from both sections. All things considered, the prospects for compromise were indeed bleak. Then, early in June, the tide began to turn. The proceedings of the Nashville Convention showed that the South was not yet as united or as militant as many had feared. Only 9 states sent delegates, and they were willing to accept as minimum terms extension of the 36 degrees 30 minutes line to the Pacific. The next month, the most formidable obstacle to compromise was eliminated when President Taylor died suddenly. Taylor's successor, Millard Fillmore, belonged to the conservative branch of the New York Whigs and was personally hostile to Seward. The new president used all the prestige and patronage at his command to promote the compromise. The omnibus bill was defeated, but this was the necessary prelude to passing the compromise measures separately. A tactic that secured the votes of either Northern or Southern extremists, depending on which bill was pending. These, added to the votes of the pro-compromise moderates, made a majority for every measure. When Clay left Washington for a rest late in July, Stephen A. Douglas became field general for the compromise and did more than any other member of Congress to convert resolutions into laws. Pressure by businessmen alarmed at the threat of disunion probably changed some votes. Others may have been secured by promises of railroad land grants or higher tariffs. The adjustment of the Texas-New Mexico imbroglio was partly the work of speculators who had bought up Texas Republic bonds at 25 cents on the dollar. Their lobbyists swarmed over the floor of Congress with arguments that some might have found hard to resist. By September 17th, it was all over. California had been admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah had been created without the Wilmot Proviso and with the promise that when the time came, they would be admitted as states with or without slavery. The law was ambiguously phrased, but seemed to mean that the territorial legislatures could either permit or prohibit slavery. Cases involving slavery could be appealed directly to the Supreme Court. Texas receded to the east in exchange for a promise of federal assumption of $10 million of its debt. The slave trade was abolished legally, if not actually in the District of Columbia. The compromise passed, but the outcome might easily have been quite different. Its defeat would almost certainly have been followed by secession. Many saw that. What they did not see was that postponement of disunion was fatal to the dream of Southern independence. Northern conquest of the South in the early 1850s probably would have been impossible. By the early 1860s, that was no longer true. Southern reaction to the compromise ranged from the die-hard disunionism of the fire-eaters to a grudging, if relieved, acquiescence by the majority. The latter made clear their intention to hold the North to both the letter and the spirit of every measure. Acceptance of compromise, however qualified, brought with it a strong conservative reaction throughout the South. The unknown perils of secession had been averted. The cotton crop was good, prices were the highest in a decade, and prosperity bred complacency. The South had bought a few years of peace at a price yet to be disclosed. The compromise was accepted more readily in the North, which had not felt as threatened or as alarmed as the South. There also prosperity played its usual role as a moderating influence, and the business community strongly endorsed the compromise as a permanent settlement. Approval was not universal. Abolitionists and free soilers were irreconcilable. Even among those who acquiesced, there was not so much enthusiasm as a willingness to let sleeping dogs lie. The apparent success of the compromise should not obscure a very ominous development, that is, the serious internal damage suffered by the two major political parties. During the preceding 4 years, sectional allegiance had repeatedly shattered long-standing party loyalties. Although the ties of party interest reasserted themselves when the crisis was over, the American political community carried a heavy burden of personal enmity and suspicion that, when added to conflicting interests in the nation at large, would finally destroy intersectional parties. Calhoun had been right. Clay's medicine treated only the symptoms, not the disease.